There Was a Country by Chinua Achebe, Part 3, Chapter 3 and 4. The Silence of the United Nations. Biafrans had their own reasons to lament the death of the widely respected Secretary-General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, who was killed in an air crash in September 1961. The Burmese diplomat U Thant, selected to replace him, would lead UN from 1961 to 1971. Unlike Dag Hammarskjöld, who was an expert at conflict resolution and a humanist, U Thant was a decisively different kind of man. A non-interventionist who deferred to local bodies such as the Organization of African Unity for policy advice and guidance, U Thant provided the OAU a great deal of latitude in decision-making and implementation. An argument could be made for these things, at least at the beginning of the conflict, but as the humanitarian catastrophe worsened, leading ultimately to the starvation and death of millions, even the most committed anarchist would have expected greater United Nations involvement. That did not happen, and I and several others believe that had the United Nations been more involved, there would not have been as many atrocities, as much starvation, as much death. In October 1969, when Ojukwu reached out desperately to the United Nations to mediate a ceasefire as a prelude to peace negotiations, his pleas were met with a definite silence. U Thant turned to the Nigerians for direction. Gowon insisted on Biafra's surrender, and he observed that rebel leaders had made it clear that this is a fight to the finish and that no concession will ever satisfy them. This was a calculated strategy from the Nigerians, who now had the international clock of the United Nations under which to commit a series of human rights violations. Failing to end the protracted Biafran guerrilla offensive, the Nigerian army openly attacked civilians in an ill-advised, cruel, and desperate attempt to incite internal opposition to the war and build momentum toward a quick surrender. The vacuum in moral and humanitarian leadership from the United Nations meant that the Nigerian federal government could operate with reckless abandon without appropriate monitoring from international agencies. There would be precious little proof of the wartime atrocities had it not been for private non-governmental agencies and individuals. In February 1969 alone, nearly 800 civilians were massacred by targeted Nigerian Air Force strikes on open markets near Owerri, Umuohiago, and Ozuabam. The Nigerian Air Force pilots were particularly noteworthy for not respecting Geneva Convention resolution describing civilian safe havens such as hospitals, refugee and food distribution camps, and centers of religious worship. In an article called "Who Cares About Biafra Anyway?" that was published in the Harvard Crimson, Jeffrey de Bloom described the horrors witnessed by Harvard University School of Public Health professor Jean Meyer. Distribution centers and refugee camps are bombed and strafed if any large numbers of people are visible in the daylight. Red Cross insignias are singled out for special attention by Nigerian bombers. Meyer saw one European engaged in walking on the Biafran side of the war front, carrying 117 dying children in his truck to a hospital in a single night. These airstrikes backfired for Nigeria, further eroding international support for their war efforts. Ojukwu seized on this opportunity, releasing a statement to the international press following an address to the Consultative Assembly in Umuahia. He lambasted the federal troops for having begun a last desperate effort in the form of a land army program. Ojukwu categorically denied any attempt by the Biafrans to surrender and reported that there would be an increased emphasis on the cultivation of staple crops to meet the mountain food needs of the starving Biafrans. Many of us wondered where and how exactly this cultivation would take place, given the fact that the land mass controlled by Biafra was at this point of the conflict a fraction of its original size. Ojukwu clearly intended to try to feed the starving masses. It was important to him for Biafrans to see him making an effort even if he failed at achieving his lofty goals. Many listening on the Biafran side were willing to receive this food for thought even if there was no food for their stomachs. Ojukwu also warned the government of Harold Wilson of Great Britain that the British will forfeit all holdings in eastern Nigeria if it continued to provide military and logistical aid to the Nigerians. Wilson's government was feeling the heat of the glaring light of international media scrutiny. On one of my trips to London on August 12, 1968, I was an eyewitness to one of the debates on the Biafran issue in the House of Commons, and I came away with this impression. If government was largely unmoved by the tragedy, ordinary people were outraged. I witnessed from the visitors' gallery what was described as unprecedented rowdiness during a private member's motion on Biafra. Harold Wilson, villain of the peace, sat cool as a cucumber, leaving his foreign secretary, Michael Stewart, to sweat it out. It was hardly surprising that many remarkable people would want to visit the scene of such human tragedy. Harold Wilson was concerned that the growing opposition to his Nigerian policy might cause him to lose the next general election. He tried to assuage domestic and international opinion by planning an elaborate trip to Nigeria. Baroness Castle famously and aptly described Lord Wilson as indulging in his near-fatal weakness for gestures as a substitute for action. By the time Harold Wilson arrived at the theater that he had set on fire on March 29, 1969, he chose to do so in an 11,000-ton amphibious assault ship called Fearless with an extra platoon of Marines aboard. Claiming to have arrived to negotiate a peace between the warring parties, Lord Wilson met only with Gowon, extending a Trojan invitation to Ojukwu to meet outside Nigeria, on Nigerian ground, or on the British ship Fearless, anchored in the Lagos Lagoon. As a meeting in Biafra was not one of the choices, all the options were unsatisfactory to the Biafrans, who turned down the purely political invitation. Like the cruel deception of locusts that appear from a distance as a welcome visit of dark clouds gorged with rain, Lord Wilson failed to deliver on any resolution to help end the Nigerian-Biafran conflict and left the land stripped bare of what many felt was the last substantive hope of peace. Azikiwe withdraws support for Biafra. Beyond the military histrionics, there were a number of important attempts at peace made by several local and international statesmen, including Nnamdi Azikiwe, Nigeria's first president, who called on the United Nations to help end the conflict in Nigeria. In a speech at Oxford University on February 16, 1969, the former president and a one-time emissary of Biafra outlined a 14-point peace plan to be implemented by a proposed UN peacekeeping force made up of international and local peacekeeping forces that will stay on the ground for at least a year during the implementation of both a ceasefire and peaceful resolution of ethnic, economic, and political tensions. Azikiwe's proposals also called on Nigeria and Biafra to sign a modus vivendi to be enforced by the Security Council of the United Nations. Azikiwe's lecture could not have come at a more critical time. I remember many of us in Biafra were hoping that his intervention would bring about a breakthrough in the stalemate. That hope was crushed when, following his triumphant lecture at Oxford, his strategy which was submitted to both United Nations officials and the federal government of Nigeria, was soundly rejected as unworkable. It is instructive to note that many of Azikiwe's strategies and suggestions, international conflict resolution with United Nations peacekeeping forces, the use of international observer teams and military personnel to complement existing resources on the ground, etc., have become standard United Nations practices today. Nevertheless, exactly 6 months later, Nnamdi Azikiwe decided to discontinue any public support for the secessionist aspirations of Biafra and turned in his diplomatic credentials. There has been a great deal of speculation as to why Azikiwe withdrew his support for Biafra. He was in a tough position and made a very difficult decision after his counsel went mostly ignored by Ojukwu. The late Dr. Okechukwu Ikejiani provides for posterity a rare insight into Azikiwe's thinking, apprehension, and intellectual struggle. Azikiwe's feeling, was that when a leader of a nation wants to go to war, he should consult people. Primarily, Ojukwu should have consulted Zik. Secondly, he should have consulted Michael Okpara, Premier of Eastern Nigeria. Thirdly, he should have consulted other leaders. The only people that Ojukwu consulted were Louis Mbanefo and Francis Ibiam. I have Ibiam's letter here. It was a great mistake. I told Ojukwu to invite these people and inform them. He told me they would compromise. That's what he said. He didn't invite them, never asked them questions. That's not how to lead. That's what led us into trouble. There are many areas we would have compromised. Ojukwu did not compromise. That's one of the mistakes we made in the war. It wasn't that Zik opposed the war. Anybody with an intellect, with a sense, would consider carefully the implications of a war. Was it destructive? There is no country that went to war that didn't suffer, not one. When we went to war, we destroyed everything we had. That's true. One must also remember that Azikiwe had spent his entire life first fighting for Nigerian independence under the One Nigerian mantra. In a curious twist of irony, he found the same position manipulated by the British he had helped oust from his homeland. To add insult to injury, Azikiwe watched helplessly as the words he helped invent were then used by the Nigerian army, made up of some of the very same people who from the get-go had rejected the concept of a unified northern and southern Nigeria. Azikiwe's supporters allege that the refusal by Ojukwu to consider many peaceful strategies to end the conflict, coupled with the prospect of annihilation of his people, was, I was told, just too much for the great Zik of Africa to bear.